All right. I don't know if we picked up a few or drove a few more out, but we're going to go into Romans chapter 11 tonight, and so you can open your Bibles there. Is this yours? Very good. Just a little bit of review. We're going to start real quick. We're going to get through this pretty quick, but review. There's 4 sections so far we've covered in the book of Romans. If you get familiar with Romans and the way that it's laid out, the fact that it's in chunks, you can get a little bit more familiar with the book and then begin to get to subcategories. And the book really begins to get a little bit easier to understand. It starts with an introduction, chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. Paul's on his way to Rome, and he's introducing himself to the church in Rome. And then in chapter 1, verses 16 through chapter 5, verses 20 through 21, Paul is explaining his gospel, which basically concludes that all the Gentile nations, which are Jewish nations, non-Jewish nations, they have rejected the knowledge of God that is given in natural revelation, and that they've kind of gone on their own, and they are in need of the gospel. And then he deals with the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation had the Word of God, they had the oracles of God, the covenants, they had all the privileges that God gave to them in the Old Testament, and yet they didn't live up to what they knew, and they're in need of the gospel. And so Paul establishes our guilt in the first 3 chapters, and then he expresses the gospel of grace, which Jesus Christ died in our place, and we receive righteousness through His righteousness, not our own. And that's the gospel of grace. Then in chapters 6 through 8, grace achieves what the law could never do, victory over sin. So Paul's explaining how we can live a victorious Christian life. Even though we're still in the flesh, we can still overcome the desires of the body and sin, and we can live a victorious life. However, he's very realistic about the fact that we all struggle, and we all get victories, and sometimes we have some defeats. But overall, we can have victory over sin. And so that's what Paul's dealing with in chapters 6 through 8. And last couple of weeks, we've been looking at the 4th section, which is Romans chapter 9 through 11, where Paul is answering the question, what about Israel? Because the church by now is becoming largely non-Jewish or Gentile, and people are asking questions. Is God rejecting His people? Was He forsaking His people? And Paul's answer to that is no, and he's explaining God's plan, which we're going to get into tonight. Now, if you look, I think I put in your notes not only those 4 sections, but the last 2 weeks as we looked in chapter 9. You will notice if you go in this outline that I will begin to adjust the outline to smooth it out. It's one of the reasons I study. One of the reasons I study like this and do digging deeper is it just keeps me from pigeonholing myself into topical preaching all the time. It keeps me in books of the Bible so that I can continue to get the big view of things, because when you're preaching and teaching a lot, you don't have time to do all the big picture stuff. And so this is one of the disciplines that I do just to keep myself connected to the rest of the story. So when I go through it, I'm refreshing myself with the study of Romans, because I haven't studied the book as a whole for a while. And so I begin to work the outlines and try to smooth them out into what was easier to remember. And so you're going to notice as I get near the end, I'm going to be changing things, so don't freak out over it. All I'm really doing is changing words to try to figure out what's the best way to help us remember it. Because statistics tell us that 95% of what I tell you tonight you'll forget in 3 days. And so I have to ask myself, what 5% do I want you to remember?
What'd you start off talking about, man?
Yeah, you don't remember within 3 minutes, huh? We are overloaded with information, and so I recognize in a teaching like this, in a setting like this where I'm kind of doing lecture and just kind of throwing things out, some people are going to take some things home and other people are going to take other things home depending on where you are. But I never want you to lose sight of the big picture. When you're studying the Bible, there's a couple approaches that will really help you. If you'll learn to outline what you're reading, it will begin to make a lot of sense, because what that will do is it'll force you to summarize what you're reading and kind of put a heading on it. So like what I do is, like, the chapters and verses in here are not inspired. So sometimes they divide chapters where they ought not to. Romans isn't too bad. But in some places they cut things where they ought not to, and they start new chapters. And so that makes it difficult because it cuts thoughts out. It cuts thoughts in the middle. And so what I do is I just go through a book. One of the things I do as a study of a book is I'm always trying to outline it the way I would outline it, according to what I think is the natural thinking pattern of the writer. And that's subjective. I mean, people disagree. But then you get familiar with kind of like the skeleton of a book. Now this is kind of long, it's 16 chapters. You got the Gospels are 28. Those are a little bit harder, but when you do some of the smaller books, it gets really easy. Then you begin to look at the subcategories in each one of those headings. And yet that's really how if you're a global thinker, you really begin to put things together. And that's called understanding. We can get knowledge of the Bible where we get to know verses and stuff, but until we can put those verses together the way that they're laid out here, we really haven't understood yet. And then the Bible says that so there's knowledge, which you gain knowledge by reading it, and you just get kind of information. Then you get understanding where you begin to put things together in the right place. And then you get wisdom, which is the ability to apply what you're learning. Like I can distinguish when I study the Bible between application and interpretation. And that's important. Because many times a verse can apply to many things, but it's not what it really meant. And you'll see that when you study the Gospels, and particularly Paul here in Romans, the way he uses various scriptures. Sometimes he's applying them, sometimes he's interpreting them according to the rules that they understood back in Jesus' day. So it can get a little bit confusing. And so what I try to do is go back to the intent of the writer. That's just what I do. And then I study the Hebrew, and I study the Greek, and I study the history. But I really start with getting familiar with a book. If you really want to learn a book of the Bible, or the Bible itself, you've got to get familiar with it. 66 books of the Bible. I had some young people in my office a month ago, whatever it was, and one of them asked me, he said, "Have you read the Bible all the way through?" And I said, "Yes, a number of times." I'm like, "Wow." I said, "Yeah, many times, backwards and forwards." But that's how you get familiar with the Bible. I'm going to take my coat off, forgive me, I'm getting hot. Are you ready? All right, so we have so far in this section, and what I've done is I've numbered it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to show the continuity. I really probably should have done that with the earlier sections of the book, and I might come behind and do that at some point, but I hope I don't lose you. So far we've covered chapter 9. We saw Paul's concern, Paul's contrast, Paul's conclusion, Paul's case, Paul's conclusion, Paul's contrast. If you notice that I'm kind of repeating myself there, I'm trying to do what is called a Hebrew chiasmus, which is many times in Scripture. You don't see this in the English, but in the Hebrew, what they like to do in an outline, they don't outline like we do. They will outline A, B, C, C, B, A. And so that's called a chiasmus. It's what I liken it to an hourglass. How do you do an hourglass? You got the top reflects. I know it looks pretty ugly. I'm not an artist, as you can tell. That's an hourglass in Hebrew. Okay? Looks more like a dumbbell, or I'm a dumbbell. But you know what an hourglass looks like. I don't have to draw it on the map for you. But a chiasmus is an order that is used throughout Scripture where they will say something and then they'll reverse order it and say it again. And that's why sometimes you ever noticed you're reading the Bible, they just said that? That's intentional. That's parallelism. It's what they do a lot of. And I'm trying to develop that chiasmus here. I'm not done. That's why you got what I've got. Because I'm trying to think the way Paul would have thought as a rabbi. And you can definitely see as you're looking at this that there is an overlap. There is some kind of order here. Doesn't guarantee that's what he's thinking. But that's why that I made a couple changes, and we'll probably make a couple more. But basically Paul's saying in this section is that he has a deep concern for Israel, that there's a difference between spiritual Israel and natural Israel. And so God has not reneged on his promise to Israel. It's just that God's promises were not to carnal, physical Israel. It was actually to the spiritual sons of God through Christ, through Isaac, who was the son of promise. And he goes into that. In his conclusion, Paul is saying that God is a God of mercy. And mercy, if you take note of the word mercy, it drives everything in this last section of Romans. Everything's about mercy, as we'll see. He touches on wrath, but he starts with wrath in the book of Romans. And now he's focusing on the mercy of God. And mercy drives election and other doctrines that we often argue about. But the mercy of God drives those things. And then in chapter 9, verses 24 through 29, he talks about us being vessels of honor and mercy to dispense mercy to a lost world. Some will receive, some will not. Then he concludes again in chapter 9, leading into chapter 10, that the cause of Israel's rejection of the gospel, which is very important, is self-righteousness. That there is in every one of us, including Israel, so don't pick on Israel. In every human being, there is a desire. If you're going to be spiritual and get a relationship with God, there's this thing in all of us that we want to do it on our own without any help. And the point of the gospel is you can't. You can never be good enough. You can never be religious enough. You can't read enough Bible. You can't give enough money. You can't attend enough church. So all those things are good. They will never make you good enough to stay in a right relationship with God. So God, through Jesus Christ, has paved the way and paid the price so that you and I can have a right relationship with God, meaning there's nothing between us. He's cleared away all guilt. He's cleared away all sin, all failure. He's moved it out of the way and said, I'm not going to make this an issue between us because of what Jesus has done. And that is the good news of the gospel. And Israel kept trying to be right with God through their good works. And all it did was end up condemning them. It's kind of like, you know, when your kids were little, and your kids are still little, but when your kids you tell them to go clean their room, many times I had to give them the gospel. I had to give them grace. Because they tried to clean their room, but their room was still a mess. But they tried, but it just didn't cut it. Israel was trying to act like they could clean their mess up, but God says it still stinks. So what He did is through Jesus, He wiped it all away. And always saying, receive it as a gift. Stop trying to earn it. And Israel kept trying to earn it. And folks, we got people like that today. And so it just seems too good to be true. And Paul says they kept stumbling upon that. And so Paul goes into chapter 10 where he contrasts that righteousness through the law, or right standing with God through keeping the Old Testament, and right standing with God through faith in Jesus Christ. And then he ends with talking about in number 7, Paul's caricature, which a caricature is like an outward, like a blurry picture of the Jews, is Israel has rejected the gospel, but God has not rejected Israel. That's kind of where we left it last week. We pick it up in chapter 11, verse 1. So we okay there? Are there any questions? Anybody I need to bring up to speed? I mean, I went through that pretty fast, but looking here, most of us have been here. Yes?
God said,
I'm just signaling to John, give me some water. Thank you, John.
3 fingers of scotch, John.
On the rocks, please. Yeah.
God's always had trouble with the Jews and being stuck in the Old Testament and doing all their things instead of rising up into the New Testament. But He didn't have that same problem with the Gentiles, is that correct?
It's partly correct. It's partly incomplete. Because really, Israel is stubborn as a nation, but so the Gentiles have been stubborn too. There's a lot of Gentiles that have not received the gospel. But Paul's going to get into this plan of what God's doing with all this, because really, you know, when I look at Israel now, after years of studying it, I see them just as human beings that God gave great favor to, but in the flesh, they're like the rest of us, they're not going to get it done. And so we're going to cover the Jew-Gentile thing in a minute. So there's a part of truth in that, but it would worry me, because one of the things that happened in church history is anti-Semitism, and Paul's going to basically give us a stern warning in thank you, John, in chapter 11 about not becoming anti-Semitic. And if the church during the Dark Ages and its early years into the Middle Ages and into the modern era had remembered that, there'd been a lot less anti-Semitism in the world.
You know, the Jews were handicapped because they were in captivity for 400 years in Egypt and learned all the Egyptian ways and all the Egyptian idols, where the Gentiles were actually spared from all that. So
well, the Gentiles did worship all those gods. Yeah, Gentiles just means non-Jew.
Yeah.
And really, that just displays that Israel was Gentile. The whole point Paul made in Romans 4 is that Abraham, when God called him, was a Gentile. Abraham, the founder of the Jewish nation, was a Gentile. He wasn't circumcised, and he didn't have a relationship with God, and he worshipped idols. That's Romans chapter 4. God called him into a relationship and promised to give him a seed and to give him a family and to become the father of a nation, which was the Jews. But God was thinking beyond the Jews into the whole world. He's going to become the father of faith for all. Okay, now Paul is now going to pick up on, in Romans 11, God's plan. You've heard me say many times, if you've been around Eagle's Nest, that I know God's heart. When I was younger, I tried to know His mind, and I just gave up on that. I can't know His mind. But I do know His heart. But chapter 11 of Romans, we do get to see a little glimpse of God's thinking and His mind. That's what Paul's going to do in this chapter. So let's pick it up in verse 1. He says, I say then, has God cast away His people? Certainly not. For I also am an Israelite, the seed of Abraham of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away His people whom He foreknew. See that foreknew? Mm-hmm. Okay? Because we've been talking about election according to foreknowledge and according to mercy and according to grace. Or do you not know what the Scripture says of Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars, and I am alone. I'm sorry, I'm going to burp. And I am alone am left, and they seek my life. But what does the divine response say to him? I have reserved for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Even so then, at this present time, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. He's back to that election of grace, whom He foreknew. So Paul was answering, what about Israel? Has God cast them away? Has He rejected them? The answer is no. He has not. What He has done is He has a remnant. He looked down in time in His foreknowledge and said, there's a group of Jews that are going to receive me. There was 7,000 that did not bow their knee to Baal in Elijah's time. So even in the midst of the nation of Israel, there was a group of people that were faithful to God according to the election, according to grace. God gave them grace. God gave them grace. And they followed Him. Majority of people did not. So it's a remnant. A remnant is a small group of a large quantity. And Paul uses that as an example of, no, God hasn't cast Israel away. He gives them two examples. He says, one, I'm an Israelite. He says there's a lot of Israelites in the first century that have accepted the gospel of Jesus Christ. But the lion's share, the larger share, did not. But he's saying there's still a remnant. There's people that have received the gospel because God foreknew them. God has given them grace in this hour to be elected or chosen. It's not like they did anything to earn it, but God saw that they would receive it. That's how I understand election. And then you got the people of Israel using it as an example that, look, even Elijah, Elijah was having a bad day. I don't know if you know the story or not, but Jezebel, the wicked Jezebel, the wickedest woman in the Bible, was going around killing the prophets of God. And Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal and Asherah on the Mount Carmel, and then Jezebel says to Elijah she's going to kill him. That's the story. And he runs from Jezebel, and he has a great victory. Fire comes down from heaven, but he runs from Jezebel. This is that story. Now, when Elijah's feeling all by himself, I'm the only one left. You ever feel like that? You're the only one that's really the only one serving God. You're the only one doing what's right. You've never felt that way? I have. Here I am, busting my hump for God. I'm trying to do everything right, and I just keep getting smacked in the face. Come on, don't tell me I'm the only one who's ever felt like that. Right? You ever feel sorry for yourself? You do all the right thing, and the other guy gets a promotion at work? You're the guy a few times in my life I've had tellers at the banks give me extra money. You ever have that?
No.
I have. I go in and give it back to them. We had the Comcast people came in to fix my mother-in-law's TV thing in her room, and he lost track of a whole, the thing that turns your TV on, the box, and a remote, brand new in the package. He forgot it. Now, a lot of people would keep it. You could run free cable. I said, we got to call them up and give it back to them. That's what faith does. Faith, we're not just living for what people don't see, we live towards God. And so, why was I even saying that? There's a remnant of people that are really trying to live right. But you know what? I'll end up probably getting a bill, and I'll probably pay more money at the end of the month. I'll do the right thing, but it'll probably cost me a few bucks. You ever feel like that? My dad used to say he was a plumber. He said, the people that he had the hardest trouble with was the ones he was trying to help. Things would break. You put his free spigots, they would break, he'd have to go back. So now not only did he lose his money on the spigots, he's got to lose money on the repair. Sometimes life is like that. Do the right thing anyway. Paul's saying there's a remnant. There's a group of people according to grace. God has not rejected Israel. There are a group of people that have received the gospel. He says in verse 6, and if by grace, then it is no longer of works. Other words, grace is no longer grace, but it is of works, it is no longer grace. Otherwise, work is no longer work. That's really deep. He's saying, you're elected, you're chosen by God. He didn't sit back in eternity and say, I like John McTernan better than this guy. God looked down in His foreknowledge and said, there's people that will receive my grace, and therefore, because they'll receive it, I choose them. That's how I look at it. He doesn't say, somebody's not going to receive me and I choose them to be lost, like some people teach it, because I see it driven by grace and mercy according to Romans. Where's the mercy and grace if God says, you know what, I don't really like you, I'm going to choose you forever to be lost? I don't think it works that way. And by the way, predestination, which is what this is called, double predestination, precedes the Reformation period of Calvin and Luther and those guys. It goes all the way back before the time of Jesus. It's not a new doctrine. Okay, we've got to, one of the things, I may not be right on all this stuff, but one thing I'm going to teach you to do is to think through, and if you get some of these really argumentative doctrines, get past the emotion and start figuring out where these things come from. Do they really come from the Bible, or do they precede the Bible? Sometimes we talk about things as if they're in the Bible and they really aren't. Now this one is in the Bible, but we need to understand the way we view election and grace does not necessarily come from Jesus. Okay? Now I mean, a lot of people get offended with me at that. But I say, go read your history. Go study this thing. And then give me some other scriptures for really, well, I'll just leave it there. Because I'm going to get enough email if this gets out on the internet anyway. Because people get really jacked up about this. Because I believe God's merciful. Nobody deserves it. Nobody deserves the gospel. But Paul's saying, hey, he's answering the question. Remember what he's saying. Israel has not been cast away. I'm saved, he's saying. And there's still a remnant according to grace. That God looked down and said, you know, there's some people that are going to receive it. They get grace. And he goes on to say it's of grace, not of works. He didn't wait for you to do something good. He said, what then in verse 7? Israel has not obtained what it seeks. The nation of Israel was seeking a right relationship with God, but it did not receive it. It did not obtain it. But the elect, these are the ones that God has foreseen and have been given grace because He's foreseen that they would receive it, and the rest were blinded. Now that word blinded is a word that means to cause somebody to have difficulty in understanding or comprehending something. To harden. It is a different word than what we used earlier when it talked about God hardening the hearts. But it's a similar concept. It means that Israel that was going to refuse, God looked down and said, you know what, they're going to refuse me, I'm going to offer them grace anyway. But that grace doesn't really work for them because they decided to harden their hearts. So the more He gives them grace, the harder their hearts get. Folks, this is happening in this country right now.
Yeah.
God is giving us grace. And what are we doing? Yeah, we're turning our back. We got cities, we've got states now wanting to not stop abortion. They want to go in the infanticide now. While we're getting grace, some are hardening themselves and going deeper into sin. But God still gives grace because of the elect, because of those who will receive grace. God is long-suffering. He's merciful. But He warns, and I would warn these folks, you keep going down this road, there's going to be a consequence eventually. This is the time to get it right. This is the time of grace. I'll say this, I'll go on record. I don't want to get political, but I believe what's happening with our economy is a gift of grace from God. You don't think this is going to last forever. This is the time to get your house in order. It's the time to get look, recessions follow times of plenty. I'm no prophet, but a recession's coming. 4 years, 5 years, 10, I don't know how many years. Get ready for it. I've taught people my whole life. God blesses us, and He expects us to be wise with our blessings. Don't just run out and spend everything. Yes, save a little portion. Put a little aside for when the rainy day's coming, because the rainy days are coming. I don't care who was Democrat, Republican gets in. It's going to happen. If you go back to American history, which I studied once, you'll find that recessions happen every 4, 6, 8 years. There's like a... Because what happens is that people buy goods, they don't need any more goods for a while, and everything slows down. Then the goods break down, and they need to buy new washing machines, they need to buy new computers, they need to buy new cars, and they all start buying new cars, and the economy picks up, and everybody thinks it's going to last forever, and then everybody gets a brand new car, everybody gets a nice house, everybody got a new washing machine, everybody's got a dishwasher, and then they don't need any more anymore, and it's the stockpiles, they start stockpiling. And it's just normal. So God is giving our nation an economic period of grace. Use it wisely, folks. Use it wisely. I'm not a pessimist, but I am realist. I look at these things. God is blessing us, but people are taking some of these things and going crazy. They're vessels of wrath. If they don't turn around, they will receive the wrath of God. We receive the grace. You okay with that? All right? He's saying Israel was hardened. They were blinded. But it doesn't mean God said, I'm blinding you and I'm blinding you. They blinded themselves. They received the grace and it caused them to run away. Now Paul gives 2 proof texts here. He goes on to say in verse 8 and verse 9, because he's being a good Jewish rabbi formally, he's going to give biblical reasons for what he believes. And he quotes a couple scripture verses. One is from Isaiah 29:10. It says, God has given them a spirit of stupor, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap. This is Psalm 69, verses 22 and 23. A stumbling block and a recompense to them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they do not see, and bow down their back always. So what Paul's saying here in chapter 11, verses 1 through 10, is just answering the question. Has God rejected Israel? No. God has dispensed grace on all of them. But the elect have received the grace. And He's going to keep dispensing grace on them. But others that will have received grace are going to be hardened and they're blinded. They just can't get it. They just won't open up. They're obstinate. That's what that word blinded can mean as well. And hardened, obstinate. Just refuse to bow their knee to Christ. We good? All right? So when somebody says that you might be, because this is what I've dealt with, this is the reason why I like to bring this stuff up. I've had people ask me, maybe I'm predestined to go to hell. I've actually had people ask me that. I say, no, you're not. Will you receive His grace? You're elect. Okay? I'm trying to help people because these things get in our heads. You know? Because we're always, if you have a guilty conscience or you have a struggle with insecurity, these scriptures will eat your lunch. The devil will pound on you, man. You're the one. You're the elect. You're the vessel of wrath. Now the next guy beside you, he's a vessel of mercy. I've struggled with this in my personal life when I was younger. I've struggled with helping people with this as I minister to people. So I want you to see this in what I can understand it, in the best that I can understand it to help you with that. All right? Verse 11, he starts another section here. So he says, first of all, he's asking, has Israel been rejected by God? He says no, because there's a remnant. Now he goes to number 9, and he tells them the rejection of Israel is not final. That Israel's falling away is not final. Verse 11, it says, I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But they are through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now this is one of the few times that the Greek language makes a big difference here. Okay? Because he just said, have they fallen? Have they stumbled to fall? No, then he says, through their fall. Did you catch that? Well, the reason for that is, there's 2 different Greek words used here. You don't see it in the English, and the translators did a bad job here. Every once in a while, you'll get all translations will do a wonderful job trying to translate the Greek, and sometimes they'll miss it. That's why if you don't study Greek, you get several different translations, because, you know, when you're looking up a word in a dictionary, there's different definitions for the word, right? And so sometimes it's hard to see that in the English. So when he says, I say that they have stumbled, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. Paul uses a word for stumbling, which means to trip. You ever trip?
Hey, Bob,
Yes.
one it says, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery?
That's a good way of saying it. It still doesn't convey, that still doesn't get really to the center of what Paul's saying. Here's the word picture. That's good, but because you'll see when I explain it like this why this is a decent translation. But I had a friend years ago that I went to Colorado with. We went to the Grand Canyon. I was 23 and I was just young and single, and we decided to do a big trip before I got married and couldn't travel and do anything fun anymore. And so we went out to the Grand Canyon. We're looking out, before you get to the Grand Canyon, you start seeing the canyon, and it's really pretty, but it's nothing compared to it's huge, but it's nothing to the Grand Canyon. And my friend was boasting about how we were going to walk down into the canyon, and we were going to do all kinds of stuff. And we're outside of the visitor center, and he's walking on a set of steps, and he trips and sprains his ankle. This is like 2 hours before we get to the Grand Canyon. And we just busted on him for the rest of the trip. The arrogance. You can't even walk down steps, let alone the Grand Canyon. Now, when he was tripping, he caught himself, and he didn't fall like flat on his face. That's what he's saying here. Israel has tripped, but they haven't fallen. That's the word picture here. That's why the translator says they have stumbled, but not beyond recovery. Like you've all done that before. You're walking somewhere. Ever since I've got trifocals, it started with bifocals. When I got my bifocals, which I resisted till I was 50, I began to be like my dad. My brother and I used to bust on my dad all the time because everywhere my dad would go, he'd trip and fall. And it's because he wore bifocals and progressives. And I used to laugh at him until I got him, and now I can't see depth when I look down, so I'm always stumbling. But I catch myself. Folks, that's what he's talking about with Israel. He's saying they've tripped, they've stumbled, but in God's plan they haven't fallen beyond recovery. They're going to catch themselves. And he's going to talk about that in the end of this chapter. And really it's going to be God who catches them. I want you to get that picture in your mind. They stumbled, but they haven't totally fallen. They're going to be able to recover themselves in God. Because the word for fall is a different Greek word. Now, I could give you the Greek word, but you're not going to remember. Did I put them in there? I think I might even left them in your notes. Okay? I'm just showing you the different words, okay? You don't even know what they are, but they're two different Greek words. One means to stumble, the other means to fall. But he doesn't use the word fall. Actually, what he says there in verse 11, the word fall, but through their fall, that word is the word for transgress or trespass. But through their sin or through their transgression. And the transgression he's talking about, what does your version say, Matt? Eric?
Transgression.
Transgression. Through their transgression. A transgression, the word for transgression is like an intentional sin or a specific sin. So Paul's saying they've stumbled but not fallen, but through their transgression, which is their stumbling, through their rejection of the gospel. That's the sin they're committing. They're rejecting the gospel. He's going to now explain the benefits to the Gentiles because the Jews rejected the gospel. And he's going to build a case that God, in His mercy, taking the very thing that people reject, He's going to use to bless people that never had a relationship with Him, the Gentiles. And then He's going to so bless the Gentiles that He's going to move the Jews to jealousy because they receive mercy and grace so that they'll come to Him. Now, I don't see a God there that's looking to reject people, do you? He's going to take our failure. He's going to take their falling. He's going to take their transgression on a big picture, and He's going to say, I'm going to use their very failure to bring people into relationship with me. And then when these people get so abundant and full, they're going to get jealous and want to get in on it. That's the mind and heart of God. That's what Paul explains here in Romans 11. And he's going to end the chapter just going, man, who can understand the mind of the Lord? Who's been his counselor? God's outsmarting everybody, in other words. He's always ahead of the devil. He's always ahead of sin. He's even ahead of what's happening in Washington, D.C. I know it's hard to believe. He's ahead of it. He's got it covered. Because he says, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. God's intention here is by giving mercy to us, the non-Jews, He would provoke them to come back to Him through grace. That doesn't sound like a God that's really mean and ugly to me. It sounds like a God that really wants to love people. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? That's going to be important, this fall thing, because look what he says in verse 12. Now, if their fall, that's the word trespass or transgression, is riches for the world, and their failure riches for the Gentiles, he's saying their sin, because they sinned and God turned to the Gentiles, man, the Gentiles are making out like bandits. The world's making out like bandits. How much more their fullness? Here's Paul's thinking. If the world is totally blessed by the fact that they rejected the gospel, what's going to happen when they accept it? Dude, it's like, I'm trying to think of a good example. It's like going to somebody's house for dinner and they serve you a steak. And it's a cheap steak. It's like, cheap steak. Kind of, I'd serve you. You know? It's a $4 steak. And the guy flavors it and, does all sautés it, marinades it, and gets it all nice and tender. And you eat that thing and it's like you got a filet mignon. What's going to happen when he gets you a good steak? That's what he's saying. If the falling and the sin of the Jews is the riches of the world, man, what's going to happen when the full number comes in? When the whole load comes in? For I speak to you Gentiles, non-Jews, inasmuch as I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. Now he's going to talk about his ministry here. I magnify my ministry. I exalt my ministry, what that means. I'm putting it up on a pedestal. My ministry to the Gentiles. Here Paul's thinking in his heart here. Let me catch up with my notes. If by any means I may provoke to jealousy those who are of my flesh and save some of them. Paul's saying, I'm doing the same thing that God's doing. I'm making a big deal of my ministry to the Gentiles to provoke Jews to want God's mercy or grace. It'd be like somebody building a brand new house right beside yours. 3 times as big, 4 times as nice. All kinds of nice swimming pool, And then you look at your house, which has been pretty nice, till you see their house, and you're like, dude, I feel like a loser. And provoke you to jealousy to want what they have. That's what God's doing here. I want them to see how blessed and rich the Gentiles are, so that they'll. And Paul says, I'm doing the same thing. I'm working in cooperation with God, so that some of them could be saved. For if they're being cast away, that means they're rejected because they don't accept the gospel. The reconciling of the world, in other words, God saying, I'm going to have a relationship with all in the world. What will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Now, let me catch up here because there's 3 different ways that is taken. Life from the dead. This is 3 different ways that interpreters interpret this, or commentaries will interpret this. And then I'll tell you the one that's right, because it's the one I believe. Some will take this as a metaphor for an unprecedented spiritual awakening. They'll say, Paul was speaking metaphorically, using resurrection as a metaphor for the saving of a lot of Jews. That a lot of Jews will come to Christ. I think that's a stretch, personally. But you will read that in some commentaries. Another way it's taken is a figure of speech for the conversion of the Jews, which is very similar to the other one. And the third way is a literal way that he's talking about the return of Christ and the resurrection of dead. That's how I take it as of right now. As of right now, as I read this text, what I believe Paul is saying is that he's saying, guys, look, if they're rejecting the gospel right now, leads to the riches of the Gentiles, at some point, because he's going to mention all Israel will be saved, when all Israel and God, the full number of Jews comes in and God turns his attention again to the Jewish nation for salvation, Christ is coming. That's how I view it eschatologically. I believe this is a key text as of right now. And I could, study something. If I think it differently, I'll tell you why if I were to change my mind. I'm not going to argue over this, but I think that's what Paul's saying. He's saying, dude, right now their rejection is leading to the salvation of the world. When they come in, dude, this thing's going to wrap up and it's going to be good. Any problem with that? We good? Yeah. Anybody else got a different opinion, would like to share it? No? All right. Verse 16. Now Paul begins to explain. This is what Paul does a lot. Paul will say something, and then he'll give you theological reasons, biblical reasons for what he's thinking. That's what I like about Paul. He won't just say something. He'll begin to make a case for what he's saying. And he goes into that here in verse 16. He's going to basically tell them, why what he's saying is true, why Israel is going to be saved. So remember, he's asking the question and answering, and he's saying, they're asking an imaginary question, what about Israel? And he's saying, God rejected me? He says, no, there's a remnant. I'm saved, there's a number saved, and it's not final. That they're stumbling, they're just stumbling, but eventually they're going to catch their breath, and God's going to reach out to them, and he's going to catch them, and they're going to come, and when that happens, the full numbers of the Jews will come in, and then Jesus Christ will return. Now, he doesn't say that here, but I believe that's what he's implying. Then he goes into some theological think tank for this. He says, for if the first fruit is holy, the lump is also holy. Now, what he's picturing here is back in the book of Numbers, Israel, when they would reap a crop, they'd have to bring in a first fruit. And they would take a certain amount of the barley or the wheat and then make a loaf of bread out of it. Now, they would have to take a portion of that loaf and offer it to the Lord. And I don't remember all the details. I'd have to go back there and read it. It's in Numbers 15. But Paul's argument is that if the portion that you're taking the loaf from and it's offered to the Lord is holy, that means dedicated to the Lord, separate, sanctified, set apart, he's saying then the whole loaf is holy. Which is what first fruits represent. Tithing is a first fruits. Tithing is a type of first fruits to where if I gave you $10, if you earn $10, the Bible says that you're to offer a tithe. A tithe is 1/10. But which of the $10 is it?
The first one.
It's the first one. That's first fruits. Does that make sense? So you got $10, you got $10 of cash.
Yeah.
Somebody count. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. A tithe is 1/10 of that. Now it's interesting to me that if you take $1 out, anybody got a dime? Somebody got a dime in their pocket? You got a dime?
Yes.
All right.
Get my 10.
This is your 10. That's where I'm going. Now you know what's amazing about this? This is 1/10 of this. Okay? Now you don't mind. He just gave me a 10th dime. He didn't even care about it. You keep it. It's yours. Now what happens if he had $1 million? How much is 1/10 of a million? I guarantee he wouldn't have handed it to me so quick. All God's asking for is this.
And what's the first fruit? The first coin you're handed?
Yeah, the first fruits would be this one.
So what if the first one drops?
Now you're getting into these hypotheticals and you're starting to sound like seminary students. If God can do anything, can he make a rock so big you can't pick it up? Remember that one? It's the principle. Now, when I go into this, I'm not going to talk about this particular thing, the tithe, because I'm not trying to go there. But when I do a series on the significance of the sacred, you never touch this. This is what's wrong with the church in America. One of the things. We touch holy things. This is holy. And I'm going to teach you what that really means in the upcoming series. And without understanding this, you can't understand the Bible. I'm going to do a series called Significance of the Sacred, Difficult Bible Stories, dealing with difficult Bible stories. Because we got a generation now that are trying to reinterpret the Bible because they can't understand some of these stories, but it's because they don't understand the sacred. The tree in the Garden of Eden was holy. You can't eat it. You can't take of it. It's not yours. Paul's saying here in this text, if the little portion of the dough is set apart, it sanctifies the rest of it, which is what the tithe and the first fruits teaches, is that God asks for a piece of it back that you don't touch in order to acknowledge that He owns it all. I used to tithe thinking I got the 10% given to God, and He got the 10%, I got the 90%. I did that for years until I was studying the Bible several years ago, and I began to really understand the principle of first fruit. I said, Lord, I've been doing this wrong all these years. You know what He said to me? You got to tithe all over again. No, He start from the beginning. He did not say that. I received mercy and grace. But I acted like this was mine. And instead, what the principle teaches is by tithing, it's evidence that you believe He owns it all. Now, so we're a steward of this. He lets you manage it. He lets you use it. You can use it the way you see fit, but you and I are going to give an account for this. Now, not in a fearful way, but my point is that's a different mindset for me to think that this is all mine, God gave me all this, to think this is all His, and I'm managing His stuff. Big difference in that. Big difference. Same way with our life, and you go to a number of things that are holy. This is what we're missing. Now, so in order to understand this text even, we have to understand holiness and what God was trying to communicate when He said certain things were holy. And I'll give you more detail on that. I don't want to ruin the series for you because I'm kind of excited about it. So He says, the first example, He's saying, look, if Israel is the first fruits, Israel is the little batch of dough. And He's saying, hey guys, they're going to come back in because they're set apart. God has a purpose for them. Then He uses another illustration. He switches gears. He says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. Now He uses the analogy of a tree. You know, what the root determines the fruit, right?
Yeah.
You know, you plant a tree, you only see what's above ground, but usually there's more below ground than above ground. A lot of trees. So if the root, which is Israel, and the patriarchs, now if you look at this biblically, it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the nation of Israel, and Aaron, the sons, and the nation that came out from Aaron. He's saying if Israel, the branches is holy, so is the tree, which is the nation. And then he goes into this explanation. If some of the branches were broken off, he leaves the analogy of the first fruit in the lump, which is a loaf of bread. And you, being a wild olive tree, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and fatness of the olive tree. So he's talking about two kinds of olive trees. He's talking about there's a natural olive tree. Everybody knows what an olive tree is. Has anybody here ever grafted trees? Have you ever seen it done where they cut and splice them and they bring them together? What are some trees that are? Is it apricot?
Apples.
Apples and apricots and cherries.
Cherries, yeah.
They used to have a tree you could buy that had 6 different fruits on it.
Really? So they would cut it and they would bind it at the. There was a way they did it in Israel. One of the commentaries described it. I don't know if I wrote it in my notes or not. But we all know what grafting is, where they bring two different kinds of trees together and they produce a different fruit, right? This is what this is his analogy. He's saying the root is Israel. And it's holy. God had a special purpose in His plan for them. Now, some of the branches of the tree that grew out of that root got broken off. Those are the people that did not accept the gospel. Those are the Jews that did not accept the gospel. And so God, wanting a full tree, grafts on the non-Jews, which are the Gentiles, which are most of us. Anybody Jewish here? So it's all of us. Okay? He grafts them together. So they grow together and become a tree. Now Paul will explain this. He's saying, he's answering the question and giving reason for his thinking. He's saying, the Jews are going to come back in. He says, because God grafted you guys in, who were a wild olive tree, he's using an olive tree, to a natural olive tree, which was Israel. He says, but do not boast. Verse 18. Do not boast against the branches. But if you do boast, remember that you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Now this is very important. The church has missed this text here for centuries. By the time the end of the first century was done, the church was largely Gentile, and we were moving a direction towards anti-Semitism pretty quickly, of where we were blaming the Jews for the death of Christ instead of the Gentiles and the whole world. Jesus died for the whole world, not just the Jews. Okay, and these bad ideas began to develop over centuries, leading us all the way up to Germany, which you have to understand, Hitler didn't rise up in a vacuum. There was plenty of anti-Semitism that was sown back in the Reformation period by great leaders who imbibed some of this theology and forgot that the Jews are holy. And that's why I say, look, when you really look at serious things in life, the teachings of the Bible somewhere. The wisdom you need, like Palestine and Israel right now, it's right here, it's in the book, man. God gave it to the Israelites. Don't mess with it. Don't mess with it, because when you mess with the holy, and now he's warning the early church that's getting largely Jewish, don't get arrogant against the Jews. Remember, he's getting ready to go to Rome. What's happening in Rome right now, there's an argument between the Jews and the Gentiles, and Claudius has already kicked the Jews out, or he's going to kick the Jews out because they're arguing over Christianity. And so many Gentiles are coming in, they're probably getting a little cocky. I don't know, I can't be for sure, but he's definitely warning against that. He says, you will say then, branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. In other words, in your pride, he's saying, you might say, look, I got their place. He says, well said, because of unbelief they're broken off. And you stand by faith. Do not be haughty, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, He may not spare you either. Now He begins to warn them. Boy, that goes over well today. You know how loving warning people is? Loving people, bad things that are going to happen is a loving action. But you know, people think you're a bigot. When you don't want to do that, you can get you killed. Wow, who do you think you are? You know. Right? I mean, you know, you can't tell people that. Well, I don't want to visit you in the hospital. Oh, you're arrogant, Bible thumper. You know? All right, you want to go ruin your life. But warning them is an act of love that today people don't value very much. And he's warning, don't get pride, because God can cut you off. For He didn't spare the natural branches. Think He's going to spare the wild branches? Therefore consider, are you ready for this? The goodness and severity of God. Now that word severity, I took a little time to look it up. Make sure let's see where I'm at. Where am I? I'm on verse what? 22? Goodness means upright, beneficent, merciful in dealings. Severity is a word that means harshness or strictness. He says, consider two things about God. And this is what's being missed today. We have no problem today talking about the goodness of God, do we? God is love. God is mercy. God is grace. I love that part about God, don't you?
Yes.
Man, I love the fact that He's merciful. I take advantage of it every day. Not in a bad sense. I say, God, I need your mercy. I need your grace. But notice what He says. Consider what else?
Severity.
Let's call it strictness. I submit to you that our current culture, even in the church, has very little room for this. Now, what's this strictness? Well, let's read the context. the natural branches rejected the gospel, he cut them off. We don't want to hear that. Consider, he's warning them, don't get proud. Now, once again, you got to contextualize this. He's not saying like they made one mistake and God got his shears out and cut them off. Hundreds of years of them rejecting God, and then when Christ showed up, they rejected him even more. Gave him 40 years to receive the gospel. Finally, he said, enough's enough. And now he's warning us, hey guys, don't look. Be thankful for God's goodness, but you need to be sober here, because God eventually cut off the natural branches. He'll cut you off too. He said, you stand by faith. You stand, if you put your faith in Jesus Christ, you receive God's goodness. If you get haughty and proud, guess what got the Israelites in trouble? Haughty and proud, they got cut off. Stay humble. None of us deserve to be saved. None of us can keep ourselves saved. Nobody, when you stand before God, is going to go, God, I'm going to give... You ever hear people, I'm going to give God a piece of my mind. Good luck. I usually say, you don't have much to give away. Don't do that. Really? I'll say this publicly. I'm just going to be glad I made it. When I stand before Jesus, I'm not looking for a castle reward, my heavenly home, I'm just looking, not even well done, I'm just looking, come on in.
And be a street person.
I'll live on the seedy side of heaven. Humble. This is so counterculture in Paul's day, because everything in that day was about status. You're going to hear more of this from me, because I think this is where we have to go. We have got to become counterculture. We have got to stop worrying about this culture calling us names. We are different. We are holy. Now, I'm not saying go out and be a jerk, be self-righteous, because he's saying stay humble. We don't deserve to be in this church any more than somebody out on the street. That's what he's telling them. But I can tell you this, we are a holy group of people. We're to be different. And if we're going to reach this culture where it is right now, we've got to get very comfortable with being counterculture and being different and being unique and being who we are in Christ, because we are accepted by faith and we live different, or we should live different. And we need to get a hold of that, not in a pride, but just in a joy. It's a wonderful thing. But one of those things that makes us different is we remember God can spank us. I've been spanked one time in my life, directly by God. I don't ever want to have it happen again. When I get in a bad mood, and John, a couple of the guys have seen, I've gone through some things over the years, and I've been pushed to the edge of myself. The thing that keeps me going and gets me right is I look back and I said, man, I got a spanking when I was 16 years old. I really don't want to go back there. Because God is strict in His mercy. Because He loves us. Now notice this. But towards you goodness, if. Anybody see that in there? If you continue in His goodness. If you continue in His grace. If you continue in His faith. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. Dude, the biggest word in the Bible is if. And I don't want to get too much into doctrine here, but, well, I'm just going to go on. And they also, now here's the good news of this. Here's the really good news. And they also, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. So here's what I see. I see in all this a need for humility to receive God's goodness. And you want to continue in that goodness by staying humble and receiving grace and recognizing we're saved by faith. No matter how many degrees you get, no matter how many churches you pastor, no matter how many lost people you save, no matter how many hospitals you build, you still need a Savior. And if you'll stay humble like that, you'll always stay in grace. But if you don't, you could be cut off. But the good news is there's people out there that have been cut off for years, and they've been proud and arrogant. They don't want to receive God. But if they'll just turn and say, God, I humble myself before you, He'll graft them back in. No one is beyond being saved. That's what that tells me. That no one, because I've had people, have I gone too far? Well, if you stay where you are, you're too far away. But if you turn, He'll graft you right back in. That's what that verse tells me. I think that's good news. You have to decide what you're going to focus on. I'm going to focus on the good news, but I am going to take the warning. Pastor Bob, stay humble, because he cut off the natural branches. But he's answering the question. Remember, put this in the context of what he's answering. What about Israel? Israel will be, it's possible if they turn for them to be saved. He says, for if you were cut off, he reports himself, the olive tree which was wild by nature, and were grafted, verse 24, contrary to nature, into the cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Saying, look, it's going to be easier to graft them in. For I desire, brethren, that you should not be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion. That blindness, or that inability, that stubbornness, that resistance, in part, has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. In other words, God's saying it's all part of His plan that He's allowing this to happen so that the full number of Gentiles, that would be us, will come in. And then when that happens, and so all Israel will be saved, as is written. And he quotes a couple scriptures here. And I'm trying to figure out if I want to stop there. He quotes a couple scriptures from Isaiah. We're going to finish this next week and get into chapter 12. I want to stop it there. I have to do a sleep study test tonight, so I have to get out of here just a little bit early. Because I have sleep apnea really bad, and they want to turn me into Darth Vader.
I'm your father.
Give my father. So that's where he's going.
I think we're off next week. Huh?
We're off next week, so I will be not here. And you will not be here either.
I won't be here this.
Thank you for getting that, Mike. We will pick up in 2 weeks, which we'll kind of revisit this again, and then we'll get into chapter 12, where he starts getting into a little bit more practical application, which is like Paul. So let's wrap this up. Paul's saying Israel has not been rejected. They've stumbled, but not permanently. If they've come out of their unbelief, it's possible for them to be grafted back in and saved. And at the end of time, when the fullness of Gentiles has come in, there's going to be, I think the way he's describing, once again, scholars disagree on this stuff, but the way I see it, at least of right now, is that at the end of time, there's going to be some kind of return to Israel. And I don't mean just Israel coming back to the nation of Israel, which that is significant. But most of them don't believe in Jesus. You realize that. Most of them don't even believe in Judaism. Okay? But it does seem like it's a sign of the times. But God is going to do a work in Israel. I don't know if it's going to be at the time of Christ's return or before. And I don't think we really know enough to build a case on it. People speculate. But Israel, God will get the full number of Jews in. And the full number of Gentiles. Right now, what we need to do is receive the grace. Stay humble. Stay humble. And look at God's mercy. There's nowhere in here, in either of these texts, or any to my knowledge, where God actually rejected somebody who did not first reject Him. I know of none in Scripture. Now, I don't know everything. I know almost everything, but I don't know everything. But I don't know of any, and I've read commentators say the same things. They don't know of any scriptures where God rejected somebody who wanted Him, but He rejected him anyway. Folks, we're the ones that reject Him. The story of the Bible is God constantly reaching out to His children and us saying, we don't want you. And as soon as we say we want you, He comes right back in. I'm going to do an Easter sermon this week on letting God back in your life. That's what He's begging to see. He wants you to let Him back into your life. That's the gospel. Not because you deserve it, but because He's a great God. And He loves you. Yes?
It's almost like we want We want the saving more than we want the Savior.
Yep. You ever see the picture of Adam and God on the Sistine Chapel? John Ortberg does a good job in his book, Everybody's Normal Till You Get to Know Him. He talks about that. He says, if you look at that picture, God is reaching out to Adam. What's Adam doing?
Yeah.
Casual. Great description of it, of that painting, and that's really accurate. God's reaching us. We just kind of like, well, take you or leave you. And it's a shame because there's nothing like living with God. Notice I didn't say for God, I said with Him. It's wonderful. Anybody else? Yes.
Pastor, the nation of Israel, they're not going to be saved as a nation. They still have to be saved individually, am I right?
Yes. Yeah, and salvation is both corporate and personal, but we don't get saved by being part of a group.
Right.
But once we get saved, we are part of the church. And we need to be part, so there's a balance, but we have to, it's the individual first. So yeah, you won't get saved. Like there are people today preaching that you can be saved by becoming a Jew, and that is erroneous. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff out there. That's why, like, I believe that we need to get back in our local churches to really having pastors and giving them time to study and learn so that they can be the resident shepherd to warn against. There are bad doctrines out there, folks. There are bad teachings. Some teachings won't bother you. If you get a hold of them, you might get a bellyache. But I know some people right now that they've been of some teachings that I'm worried about their salvation. It's gotten that bad. And as a pastor, it concerns me because I'm like, I watch over your souls as one who give an account. You know, and I warn people. You have no idea how many people I have warned in my ministry career. Some have heeded, most have not. But I've said, this is going to be disastrous, and I love you enough to risk our relationship to tell you. That's why Paul said in Colossians 1:28, says, him we preach, warning every man. I can't quite quote it now, it's a little late. But warning every man and testifying to make that they would come to perfection or maturity in Christ Jesus. I butchered that verse, but if you look it up, it's Colossians 1:28. We as preachers are supposed to warn you as well as inspire you. Okay? Paul warned in here, but he also let us know God is a merciful God. I don't know why people don't come to him. He is the best being in the universe. He's awesome. He really is. I include him in everything. I even include him when I'm tempted. I start talking to him, Lord, I'm really being tempted. You know what, Lord? It's hard to be tempted and talk to God at the same time. I really want to do wrong here. I want to be angry. That's the thing I struggle with most. I really want to be angry. Bob, you want me involved here? Yeah. But Lord, I really want to be angry. You know better. Anything else? We'll wrap it up.